This is a podcast sponsored by To Enlighten Research. I'm Sara Siqueira. Today we are going to talk about choosing wisely in observational studies. Welcome, Amanda.
Hi, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be back.
You know, Amanda, there are situations where observational studies can be applied, especially as an alternative when randomized control trials are unethical, unfeasible, and expensive to be carried out. In observational studies, the investigator only observes, which means that there is no intervention performed. Thus, as strength points, observational studies have participants more similar to clinical practice due to its level of heterogeneity, and from some observational studies, new hypotheses can arise to be tested throughout our randomized control trials. It can be a proper approach to complement or expand findings for randomized control trials, considering certain intervention aspects. As well, observational studies can determine whether post-market drugs are true effectiveness and safety in a long-term follow-up. Therefore, when well designed and conducted, observational studies can bring relevant information. We know that to select the study design, it is crucial to take into account the research question, the available time and cost to perform the study, as well as all strength and limitation of each type of the study. The right answer is one that accomplishes these requirements.
Indeed, Sarah, that's the challenge for Dr. Abba. She's a postdoc fellow from Sweden and she's currently in São Paulo, Brazil, and she will stay for 2 years to work in São Paulo mental cohort study with Dr. Tufo. The São Paulo mental cohort study has been carried out for 5 years. In fact, she was assigned to work in the Psych-Hosp Psychosis in São Paulo study, one of the secondary studies of São Paulo mental cohort study, aiming to better comprehend psychotic disorders. This study comprised 2,150 patients who started in the cohort free from the disease and are being followed up in the last 5 years, accounting with mental health professional care, neuroimaging, blood tests, neuropsychological assessment batteries. So far, almost 1,000 cases of schizophrenia were detected during the follow-up.
Great, Amanda. Let's talk about the options she has to plan the study in the context of observational studies. The cross-sectional study. From this type of study is the best way to obtain the prevalence, which means the number of cases in a population at a given point of time. The researcher decides the variable or multiple variables of the study population related to the research questions to be studied. At a point of time, the participants are evaluated in order to detect if they were exposed to something of interest or if they have the outcome of interest. Here, it is expected that some participants will not be exposed or have the outcome of interest, which differentiate cross-section studies to cohort or case control studies, since in the latter, exposure and or outcome are mentioned. Cross-sectional studies barely face ethical issues. The sample of the population can be extracted from Psychosis in São Paulo study, so cross-section studies can be integrated to cohort studies. There is no follow-up, which also means less resources, so in general, it can be a quick and not expensive study.
Yes, Dr. Abba's idea is to obtain the prevalence of psychotic disorder in the psych-hosp sample. Besides, she intends to extend the original score of psych-hosp in order to guarantee a population-based survey and to prevent case selection similar to what occurs in the convenience samples. Moreover, she wants to evaluate the neuroimaging in the sample to further correlate the findings with the disease.
Thanks, Amanda. Here are the points where the disadvantages of cross-sectional study raise up. In a specific point of time, it tries to infer causality. However, it's not possible to distinguish cause and effect, or the sequence of events with this approach. Therefore, carrying out this type of study proposed by Dr. Abbas can only bring new hypotheses. No temporality of an association can be established. In fact, it is very difficult to establish causality. Therefore, causal relationship needs to be tested in cohort studies. Back to Dr. Abbas' studies, by this cross-sectional study, there is no way to assure that any change in brain image is a cause of the disease instead of a consequence of the disease.
Absolutely, Sarah. It is important to address that cross-sectional studies are not the best approach to study rare disease. Although it is the best approach to estimate prevalence, here prevalence incidence bias can occur when short duration disease is associated with underrepresentation of cases and when long duration disease is related to overrepresentation of cases. Now let's move to the next option, the case control design. Here, it is often a retrospective study when participants with the outcome of interest are combined with a control group who do not have the outcome of interest. Cases and controls are potentially obtained from different populations. In this study design, one outcome of interest per study is often evaluated. Thus, it is possible to detect the ones exposed to a factor or the prevalence of a variable in the study groups or the predictors for an outcome. It is a simple study to carry out, it is quickly performed and requires a small sample size when compared to cohort studies. The information regarding exposure is drawn by asking participants through interviews or questionnaires or through previous existing records.
Nice, Amanda. Besides, it is a great strategy to investigate rare, long latency disease as well as disease outbreaks. Nevertheless, as you know, there are relevant limitations to be highlighted. Ideally, controls should be obtained from the same population as cases. The main issue is to find accurately matched controls in the several characteristics related to the participants with the outcome of interest. So, bias can be a major problem, especially selection bias and observational and recall bias. Moreover, it is not proper to evaluate rare exposures and accounts with exclusion of the cases that participants had died, causing significant imbalances in case and control exposure conditions.
Perfect, Adam. Now let's talk about the best approach to detect the incidence and natural history of one condition, which is using a cohort study.
Indeed, Amanda, according to Song and Shang, the term cohort is derived from the Latin words cohorts. Roman legions were composed of 10 cohorts. During battle, each cohort or military unit consisting of a specific number of warriors and commanding centurions were traceable. The word cohort has been adopted into epidemiology to define a set of people followed over a period of time.
Great, Sarah. Cohort studies follow up in two parallel groups to compare the participants with risk factors or features of interest with a control group to evaluate the outcome of interest as well as multiple outcomes of interest at the same time. Here, the case and the non-case are drawn from the same source. In the retrospective cohorts, existing data is used and the period of the study can be for several years. However, the study is completed when the investigator ends up collecting the existing data and analyzing them. For this type of study, when well designed and controlled for bias and confounders, it is possible to determine whether it is cause or effect since the events are assessed in chronological order. In other words, the exposure is measured from the beginning, so there is a temporal relationship.
Exactly, Amanda. And from cohort studies, it is possible to analyze the risk factors, also called predictors. So it allows us to estimate the relative risk. While retrospective cohorts can be cheaper and quickly, prospective cohorts are often long and expensive studies. Furthermore, the major problems related to cohort studies are risk of confounders, selection bias, susceptible to recall of information bias in retrospective cohorts. Also, it is possible to lose follow-up, and the exposure status can be modified during the study. As expected, this type of study is not appropriate when rare outcomes are studied due to the difficulties to reach it. However, a prospective cohort well designed and with adequate control matched can mitigate the risk of selection bias.
In brief, Sarah, let's do a quiz now. What is an ideal observational study accounting to a well-defined population?
Well, a cohort study.
Great. And what's an ideal observational study accounting that cases and non-cases derived from the same population?
Again, a cohort study.
Amazing. Now, what is an ideal observational study accounting that exposure is estimated at the beginning?
Here we go again with a cohort study.
Awesome, Sarah. Now, what's an ideal observational study that collects and evaluates data for only selected and adequate number of samples?
Now, the right answer is a case control study.
Brilliant, Adam. But how about the hybrid study designs, such as nested case control and case cohort studies?
Wonderful, Amanda. Here, the choice of the participants is made according to a case control approach, while the study occurs in a well-defined cohort. In these hybrid study designs, the exposure can be estimated at the beginning. They allow to choose for a certain number of cases and controls, which reduces the analysis costs and it can fit rare disease. Also assure that case and non-case are drawn from the same source, which means the same cohort. Hybrid studies are a good strategy when the exposure of the entire cohort is not efficiently evaluated due to cost, lab intensity, and when leftover samples can be used for further analysis.
Very good, Sarah. The hybrid studies can vary according to different methods to select the control. In the nested case control studies, the controls are chosen every time a case happens. The controls is matched on time at risk to the case, and it is possible that a control can be chosen for more than one case and also that a control turns into a case. Here, the control is often less representative of the total cohort, and to match a case and a control is more likely to occur. Here, it is also possible to deal with less risk of recall bias in comparison with case control study due to the data of interest being collected previously. On the other hand, in the case cohort studies, the controls are chosen from the baseline cohort independently if a disease status is chosen as a control. So, all cases noted in the cohort are chosen as case, and it is possible that some cases be part of case and control groups. Therefore, the subcohort represents the total cohort. Nevertheless, to match case and control can be more difficult. Here, the loss of follow-up distorts the study, and a well-defined cohort is very important.
Amazing, Amanda. Important to highlight that in the nested case control study, for each different endpoint, it is necessary to make a new choice of the control. While for case cohort study, several diseases can be evaluated by using one subcohort. Moreover, the statistical analysis in case cohort studies is more complex. In the end, Dr. Abba needs to rethink from the beginning. So, after all this discussion, taking into account the period of her postdoc fellow, we would suggest a case cohort study, not to determine a prevalence, but because with this approach, it is possible to study rare disease and to identify the incidence for more than one psychotic disorder. Also, she can use the neuroimage to help to identify linkages among the psychotic disorder and the exposure. However, a causal attribute of an exposure will need further studies to be established. The statistical analysis can be a limitation. Nevertheless, she can try to account with a good statistician.
Very good, Sarah. Thank you so much for this amazing discussion. Thank you all so much for listening.